You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. For people who grew up in religious or conservative environments, sex wasn't just something that you didn't really talk openly about. It was something that you were taught to fear or feel ashamed of. Purity culture has taught generations of young people that their personal value and worth is tied to their sexual choices, meaning that quote-unquote good people wait to have sex, while quote-unquote bad people don't. However, those messages can leave lasting marks, shaping how people see their own bodies and desires, not to mention the way that they approach relationships. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about what it's like to grow up in purity culture and how to move past it, including the process of unlearning shame, embracing your sexuality, and learning to approach sex and relationships on your own terms. We're also going to talk about whether it's possible to still hold on to and embrace your faith while letting go of purity culture. My guest is Lauren Elise Rogers, a certified holistic sexuality educator and embodied intimacy and relationship coach. Her approach to education and coaching is deeply rooted in her own pain-to-purpose journey. Lauren brings an empathetic and non-judgmental approach, offering practical tools that empower her clients to take ownership of their pleasure and grow in confidence and connection. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Hi, Lauren, and welcome to the show.
It is so wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you. So we met in person recently because you were a student in one of my study abroad courses, which was so much fun. So I'm delighted to have the chance to chat with you again. Let's start with your story. You've spoken openly about growing up in purity culture. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like in your own life? In other words, what kind of messages did you internalize about sex, desire, or your body? And how did those things shape your sense of self?
Yeah, I would be happy to, because as a human being who was raised inside of purity culture, I did not know that purity cultures existed. And so I think conversations like this one are so crucially important, because now in my work with folks who have come out of purity cultures, it's been very helpful for them to know that they are not alone. So yes, let me share that I still live in the town that I was born and raised in here in Central Virginia in the middle of the Bible Belt. I literally live in the town that Liberty University exists in. So if anyone is familiar, that is where Jerry Falwell Sr. started this whole thing called the moral majority that took this country of ours on a ride that led to a bunch of abstinence messaging, abortion negative messaging, a bunch of stuff that we'll talk about later. But my parents were married by Jerry Falwell Sr. They literally existed their union by this human being, and they were both first generation Christians. And I say this in quotation marks because it really gets specific. And I deeply believe that they wanted something really great for me. I think they wanted something different for their child than what they experienced, which was typical heartbreak and sexual encounters that were less than fulfilling as young people. So they entered me into church culture. I received messages from when I was very young that my heart belonged to my father. I went to a purity ball wherein I was given equivalent to an engagement ring, saying that my body and my heart and my soul belonged to my father until he gave it to my husband on my wedding day. So then my parents found an even more specific niche of religiosity that it consisted of a courtship model. And I am talking like the olden days where you would go and give a calling card to the woman's parents and you would sit on her doorstep and wait for her to accept you. And so I was really indoctrinated to believe that the best way to enter into any form of long-term partnership would be to keep my heart pure. And that anything else was practicing for divorce. So I was very, very mindful of these rules. Some of the folks I talk to now say that they wanted to rebel. They always thought it was a little crazy. Not I, Justin. I really was like signed into this and really thought I'll do this the best way. So dated no one until I met the man who would become my first husband when I was 18 years old at a dinner party with my parents and other people, very appropriate. We got married when I was 21 years old, and I was a virgin on my wedding night. My mother, who was dying of pancreatic cancer at the time, said to me on the night before my wedding, "Lauren, make sure you take care of your husband's needs and everything else will be fine." Now, as a young person who had grown up homeschooled, given zero sexuality education, this was all I was given. I was never taught about my own body, about my own pleasure. I was instructed that masturbation did exist, but it was only a thing that boys did. And it was only because they were struggling with temptation, and that I would never ever encounter such a thing. So I got married and our wedding night was fine-ish. I tried my hardest to be a good wife, a good partner. And yet I always felt that my desire for sex was so much greater than my husband's. So instead of considering a multitude of things, I went to the only purity culture instruction I had been given, which was something is wrong with me. And so for a decade, I tried to figure out what was wrong with me. Did I need to serve more? Did I need to become meeker? Less, until I was this shriveled version of myself. And someone started having dreams about me. And they took me on a walk and they said, "What's really going on?" And it was only then that I shared about my then husband's alcoholism, these things he struggled with called parasomnias, just these crazy things. She got me into counseling. I got out of that marriage, lost my entire life because divorce is not an option inside of many religious structures, only to find out years later that my husband is happily gay. And so it was so devastating to this body of mine that the thing that could have helped so much was any form of education. So yeah, messages that I got were that my body belonged to God and to my Father, that my purity truly was directly correlated to my value inside of this religious system, and that as a woman, my greatest role on this earth was to get married and have babies. And other than that, it just all fell in line under there.
That is quite the story. And, I think your story demonstrates how purity culture is hard on everyone too, right? So, your husband in that case, sounds like he had a substance use issue and was obviously closeted about his sexuality. And so he was trying to conform to this mold too, but clearly that was also taking a toll on him as well. And so purity culture is damaging for everyone. I think, a case can certainly be made that it does really promote that sexual double standard. And it's worse for women in a lot of ways in terms of creating this idea or perpetuating this idea that women's bodies belong to men. But it is also hard on everyone in these cases.
I would so agree. And now, fast forward to what I do and we'll get more into it, but I work with men who've come out of these purity cultures. And what is so devastating to me is that these good men got into relationships, into hetero relationships with these women they loved, Justin, only to find out that these women now felt obligated to give them sex. And they're so confused. I did learn about this thing called erotic plasticity, which you can teach me much more on. And I did deep dives of research on why is it that a person in a male body and a person in a female body could go through the same exact church upbringing, and one would come out on the other end. And totally different. And it was typically my male clients that I was seeing that they were like, yeah, I got that messaging, but I don't know. It feels really good when I stroke my penis, so I'm still going to masturbate. And yet women just believed these messages so much more. And it truly all whittled down to this erotic plasticity, that women were more erotically plastic in these situations. But yes, to your point, I see so much of this suppression of desire because of the heteronormative scripts that also run through the purity culture messaging, that marriage should be between one man and one woman. And if you fall outside of that, well, you're in sin. And so many folks are suppressing, and it's coming out sideways.
Yep. It turns out that suppressing things doesn't tend to work all that well. Now, when it comes to leaving purity culture, a lot of people who are exiting it kind of describe it as this identity crisis. It's not really an easy thing. People often feel torn, and there's kind of this grieving for that past life. There's anger that's often present, but there's also kind of this feeling of liberation that's going along with it at the same time. And so it's a lot of mixed emotions. So tell us a little bit about how that process unfolded for you emotionally and psychologically.
Yeah, I need to be really clear because it was devastating. When you leave a purity culture, you're most often leaving your church and you're most often deconstructing a religion, which was a structure that provided you often with community and comfort and reassurance. And what's so deeply mournful about this is that there are great components of a faith and spirituality practice. And oftentimes you are losing everything. So for me, I also lost my home and I lost my community because none of my friends were in agreement with my decision. And so I ended up in this basement apartment that the heat didn't work. It was tiny, like so small. And there was a rat dying in the wall. And it was just literally rock bottom. And it was there that I really thought, okay, I have a few choices. I could step in to this liberation and I could live a completely different life. And yet I really, really still feel that I am this thinking person. I love research. I love learning. And so what would it look like to start really diving into so many of these messages that I was given? And I've got everyone telling me that I am now just in sin. And I was given two options that I was either going to be a virgin or I would be a whore. And so am I now a whore? And it was there that I started just reading everything I could on conditions and systems of belonging that are contingent upon behaving and believing. And was that even ethical? Did I even align with that? And what else possibly was I never taught about my own sexuality, about vulvas and vaginas and clitorises? What could it be? And that just led me from one book to another book to another book. And it was there that I started to formulate a new value system. And for me, that was paramount because I was already alone. And I thought, I know I'm going to have to construct something else, but upon what foundation? Because I had literally obliterated the foundation. So yeah, I'm very glad that you spoke to that because it's very alarming and isolating. And every single client that I now work with has gone through the same thing. And they are in mourning and they should know that that's okay. And I truly think it's a beautiful experience if we view it as the start of the next chapter.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit about this episode I did recently on sexual trauma, where we were talking about this concept of post-traumatic growth. And it's kind of the same thing in a situation like this, where there is that trauma of leaving that community and everything behind that you had, but also seeing it as this opportunity to grow and to discover new aspects of the self and seeing it as a starting point, a new beginning in a lot of ways. But it's very good that there are people like you out there who can kind of help people along that journey, because a lot of people try and do this on their own. And as you know from your own experience, it's a struggle.
I used to literally say to folks every day that I am the me that I needed then, because it is not impossible. I deeply believe it's a part of my core that we're all inherently able to heal and become all on our own. And yet, boy, was it hard? Was it lonely? There was no one to bounce thoughts off of either, right? Because I was crafting my own narrative. I was learning about comprehensive sexuality education. That's not offered around me. And I truly looked like the harlot and the one who had gone rogue. And it was really would have been necessary and helpful to have a me.
So something a lot of people struggle with when they're leaving purity culture is shame. Even if you've rejected this idea of purity culture and you've started moving on, that shame can still linger for a really long time. So based on your own experience and also your experience as a sex educator and coach, how do you work through that shame? And, what do you do to help your clients work through the same thing?
Shame. I remember learning in my sexuality education school that shame and guilt are the number one cause of sexual dissatisfaction and dysfunction. And for some, that might seem abysmal, but for me, it was rather comforting because I thought my entire life has been governed by shame. And so I will often start by just purely some education with individuals because it helped with me that shame is usually from an outside source. That doesn't come from an internal space. And so I will allow us to lean into other things that are free of shame. Other things that feel pleasurable, maybe the way a favorite food tastes in our mouth. And I will say, do you feel any shame about your enjoyment of this thing? And usually most human beings say, no, it's been good. Okay, well, what about something else? And somebody will mention their love of travel and how juicy that feels to them. And I'll say, great. Who in your family celebrated travel? Oh, my grandmother, she loved it. And they'll start to go on. And this is what we usually do to start to uproot the sexual belief or the pleasure negative belief that is associated so often with sexual behaviors for those inside of purity cultures. And I like to teach folks about the concept of psychological splitting when inside of something like a purity culture, you are told from a young age that your body is sinful. Right? This idea of Plato's dualism, that the mind is holy and the body is evil, tells you from such a little age, don't touch yourself there. Don't enjoy that. Don't expose yourself to more of that. Stay away from what feels good. And so what starts to happen is our sexuality develops in the shadows, in these deceitful and secret places wherein we do feel shame because we cannot come to a sex positive adult or a trauma-informed adult and have beautiful, open conversations with them about these developmentally normal experiences. And so we'll take something, we'll find the first moment of shame on their sexual timeline, because we all have them if we grew up in purity culture. And then we'll just approach it with the lens of a sex positive parent. And it's so cool in my work, I could get teary, the way I get to hold that space for my clients to say, hey, actually, this is what the research shows. Actually, that behavior, that sex play that you were engaging with the neighborhood kid, that was perfectly fine. That was healthy and developmentally normal. What we always look out for is something like coercion or a harsh response from an adult. And when they notice, oh, well, I did have a harsh response from an adult. Oh, that's what started to bring in the shame. And then we start to talk about how good it is when we're able to acknowledge that it is good to want and that it is good to be able to stand in that wanting because we become people more full of integrity. And then when we can negotiate these wants with another, we cease to keep taking from another. And then we start to see, oh, wait, there's all these options and I don't necessarily need to feel shameful about my sexual wants because they're not actually a demand of another, which is what we were told. We were told that if we leaned into sexuality, we would slide down the slippery slope into depravity. And instead, the sex that we want is not a ravaging beast. David Lay calls it a ravaging beast, and I love it. It is not that. Instead, it is something that we can take accountability and responsibility for, and that's not full of shame at all.
Are you looking to boost your sexual health and wellness? Well, there are a ton of supplements on the market promising to do just that. But the hard truth is that finding one that actually lives up to the hype is tough because this market is full of products that contain questionable ingredients or that frankly just don't work. That's why I'm excited to introduce you to VB Health. VB Health is in the business of trust and transparency. Their sexual wellness supplements are doctor-formulated, rigorously third-party tested for purity and potency, and made right here in the USA. Whether you're looking to give your libido a kickstart, to support the health of your semen, or increase vaginal wetness or lubrication, VB Health has something for you. So if you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a sexual health supplement that's effective and that you can feel confident about, it's time to check out VB Health. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin for 10% off or click the link in the show notes. Yeah, I love that approach. And I think it is really the starting point for all of this is learning to unburden yourself of all of that shame, because the more that shame lingers, the harder it is to just open yourself up to experiencing any form of pleasure or enjoyment of sex. But even when you've kind of dealt with the shame, I have to imagine there are still other aspects of that sexual healing process because, if you're somebody who grew up being taught only negative things about sex. And so you grow up being very fearful of it, or you see sex as something that's dangerous. It can be kind of hard to flip that switch later and open yourself up to pleasure. And you might also not have any idea what it is that you even want or enjoy, right? Because you've been taught that masturbation is bad and you shouldn't touch yourself. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you just even connect with your body, figure out what it is that you want, and also just learn to stop seeing sex as something to be afraid of and instead see it as something that, can be safe and fun and pleasurable.
It's my favorite because yes, once we've gone through the erasing, I usually use the image of a whiteboard, right? Kind of erasing these old narratives about sex as something that is bad. Then, yes, okay, so you've been given the permission that sex is good. Well, that's horrifying sometimes at worst, and at best, really risky. And so Dr. Jack Moran and the Erotic Mind had these 7 steps to sexual healing that I often share with my clients, because after we've navigated the gray zone, which is often these early stages, then we acknowledge and mourn our losses. So usually, and you already named this, there's this feeling of sadness that comes over us, of the years of lost, right? I can never go back. And for so many of us, we should have been getting to experiment with our sexuality in our teenage years, in our adolescence. And that's the thing that was taken from us. And so it's a real bummer. It's a real bummer. So then we start to risk new discoveries. And so this is the part where it's so good to have someone in your corner, because it does feel risky to try these things. It does feel risky. So we do a lot of, yes, developing a personal pleasure practice is what I would call it with so many of my clients. For others, we would call it solo sex or masturbation, of course. But so often we just need a new framework for this. So yes, sitting with oneself. For some, Justin, they can't even go to that first. We need to start with simply a 5 senses experiment. And for some of my clients, that's an assignment to go off on a walk and to really pay attention to one thing that brings you pleasure you can hear, then that you could see, then that you can taste, and normalizing that experience of pleasure in the body and noticing, looking around you, did it harm anyone? Your own experience of pleasure, did that harm anyone? So then we, yes, spend a lot of time focusing in on the body and what we want. Then a lot of times we'll start tiptoeing into some form of erotic material that is safe for us to experiment with on our own, whether it's written erotic literature, whether it's erotic visual media or audio media, that we can start to see, oh, just because I enjoyed this moment, again, checking our surroundings, doing this cognitive model of check-in. Ooh, am I still okay? Yes. And then when we start to bring it to touch with another, I usually utilize a game like Dr. Betty Martin's 3-minute game, so that we can start to learn to negotiate touch. So many inside of purity culture absorbed this messages that if you were in a romantic relationship with someone, that meant that sex needed to look like this. There were not a lot of creativity given to you. And so to have a time frame here, to have you get 3 minutes, and within that 3 minutes, no one is going to push you past. Well, then we start to regain this understanding of agency, this understanding of giving a gift and receiving a gift. I have some precious clients right now who were very educated inside of this purity model, and all they were taught was service. They were given the message that if you served your spouse, then your spouse would want to serve you, which is one way of giving a gift. But there's another way, which is taking enjoyment in your partner's body. And most of my clients now come to me and they say this: I want my partner to want me more. But they've never been given a safe option to be in their wanting. So we usually start with a very structured game so that all parties know that we will be able to renegotiate at any point and do a check-in. And then it's just really beautiful to see trust start to bloom inside the body.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, it sounds like there are lots of implications here of purity culture just for the way that people approach relationships. And I think it can lead to this tendency to deprioritize your own needs, to be a people pleaser, and to always put your partner first. And so in that way, you might never really get to know what it is that you actually want or enjoy because your needs were never a priority. And that can be kind of a big mental shift and reset when you're leaving purity culture. Is like, oh, my needs do matter. And you have to learn to be empowered and have the agency to actually communicate about what those needs are. So it really is a big shift in a lot of ways.
It truly is. And again, what a joy it is for me now to get to sit with individuals who haven't had to blow up their lives and end up on a basement floor, and who are instead going, wait a second, we think that maybe there's some things off. Because when I ask my partner what they want, they can't tell me. And do you think that this could be attached to purity culture? And when I say, of course, right? This idea that we were given that blessed is he who gives rather than he who receives, right? This idea that, again, the mind was the holy thing. The body was the dangerous thing. When I show clients, oh, look at these individuals who sat at the Council of Nicaea and look what they thought about the body and about women. And that, no, there's a reason why your partner, your wife who's in a female body cannot get in touch with these things. She was never encouraged to. She was taught that she was a temptress and that she was going to be seducing men at all times. And so she was the gateway to the devil. And when they can start to see this, I often say it starts to take the finger of blame away from each other and towards the system, which is where we should be shaking our fingers. Because truly, when we give a good gift to a partner, it is joyous to us. But in order to be able to give a good gift, we need to know what the other wants. And it is the most joyous, scary, but beautiful and sacred work.
So I want to ask you a somewhat spicy question, which is whether people can hold on to their faith while letting go of purity culture. I'm curious for your take on this. And, it's something that I think we often position religiosity and faith as being completely at odds with sex positivity and sexual pleasure. But I don't think they have to be that way, right? And I've seen examples in my own life of people who have learned to balance those two things. And I've also seen cases where people really struggle with it and it feels like they can only do one or the other. But I'm curious for your take on this. Is it possible to remain religious, to maintain your faith without adopting the sexual shame that often comes along with it?
It is such a spicy question. And I would say it's a question I get asked often because I think folks expected me, who came from such misogyny, such oppression, to have 100% swung to the other end of the pendulum and be irate. I truly think that people expect me to be on my mountain of anger for the rest of my life, but I did too much research on how that could cause autoimmune diseases in myself, so I needed to get somewhere else. And I absolutely believe that one could be a person of faith and have great and juicy sex. And this is what I tell my clients, is that we have got to go down to the foundation again, though. We have got to weed our metaphorical gardens. Together, we've got to sit down and we've got to realize where these beliefs about sex and the bodies of others were planted inside of our sexual understanding. And we got to get weeding. Because if we don't, what will happen is that we will assume that these things that we believe are in alignment with our Christian theology. And what it is often is just these pieces of embedded theology, that they are just almost, I like to compare it to a sidecar on a motorcycle, right? It's like little bopping along with the motorcycle. It's not the tenets of the faith. What it was instead was these usually people in male bodies who decided at some point they needed to suppress another for them to stay in power. And this is worshiping tradition instead of the God that you claim to follow. And if we cannot look at the true roots of some of these beliefs that we have about women's bodies, people in bodies other than male and white, then we are worshiping the wrong thing. There's this beautiful, beautiful journal article entitled Good Sex and Religion, where these 12 women from different faiths sat down over a year. They met every quarter, and they talked about the ways in which religiosity, religious orthodoxy had suppressed anyone but white men who are in an hetero existence. And they found a multitude of ways. But when we center sex that is good and right and true, when we center justice, when we actually look at this person in the Bible that we call Jesus and the way in which that human lived, I think we can see time and again that no, we should be uplifting pleasure and joy and abundant flourishing. And I do think they can coexist, but not without weeding our metaphorical sexual gardens.
Yeah, I like your approach to that. And this reminds me a little bit of a conversation I had on the show some time back with Dr. Eric Sprankle, where we were talking about navigating sex and religion and the complex process that he goes through with a lot of his clients who are struggling with a lot of this religious sexual shame and, some of the different reframings that he approaches to them. And part of it is helping people to understand that for any given religion, there are always multiple interpretations of it. Like, if you look at something like the Bible, for example, there are a ton of different versions, right?
So many.
And that's like one thing. But then there's also like all of these things that are written in these religious texts where you just sort of pull them out and it's like, well, do you believe in this part? And they're like, well, no, that's not like a rule that I follow. And then it's like, well, why do you believe in this other part that says like, being with somebody of the same sex is bad, right? So it's about sort of helping people to understand that like there isn't just one way to interpret any given religion. And sometimes that gives people kind of the freedom to say that it gives them the freedom or the ability to incorporate the aspects of the religion into the self that kind of work with them, that are congruent with them, while still also being able to be this sexual being and person who can shed that sexual shame that they were previously carrying.
Yeah, I'd like to also point my clients back to the fact that the World Health Organization says that sexual health is fundamental to the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. And most people who still want to ascribe to a Christian faith, for instance, they deeply believe in the health and flourishing of families and communities. And so when I really sit with them and say, you know what, your good sex, both with yourself and with your partner, actually benefit your children and your community. It actually is life-giving. And when I sit down and show them my sexual values guiding questions that literally list things like, is it joyous? Is it affirming of others? Is it life-giving? And we sit there and we look at these different sexual values guiding questions. And I say, was the sex that you were having before you started this work all of these things? And they'll look down. They'll say, no. And I'll say, I didn't pull this out of scripture, right? But wouldn't you say this aligns with so much of the scriptural teachings that you came from and you still want to walk in alignment with? And they'll say, absolutely. And I say, yeah. Then sometimes when we can look through some sex positive lenses, we can see that actually this is more in accordance with our faith than what we were having before, which was actually oppressing another. It is actually not joyous and life-giving. And it's one of my favorite things when someone can come to a deep understanding of, oh, this wasn't faith, this was religiosity. This was all of this embedded theology that I had just blindly obeyed. The Reverend Beverly Dale does this beautiful example of deliberative theology versus just this obedience mindset. And when I encourage my clients, like lean into it, right? Let's really deliberate with this. Argue with me. Let's do this. Let's figure out who is being centered. And do we still agree with that in these older texts? Well, then it's really beautiful to watch individuals come to an informed decision, an informed place of faith, because then we can see, oh my goodness, this is actually more in alignment than I was even before. And I now can celebrate my faith and my sex.
Well, this has been fascinating, Lauren, and I really appreciate you sharing your story. I can't wait to continue our conversation in the next episode, where we're going to dive all into the topic of abstinence pledges.
Can't wait.
Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Go to sexedforyou.com/connect or find me on Instagram, my most active platform. And the real full handle is sex_ed_for_you. But typically, if you search Sex Ed for You, I will come up if I'm not shadow banned in this given moment.
Well, that's always a question that we don't know the answer to when we work in this area. But so thank you so much again for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you for having me, truly.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.